what farmers have found is that by spraying glyphosate, you can speed up that dry down. So the seed is mature, but the plant still has some greenness and some viability to it as it goes into its last gasps of life of the season. And so the glyphosate speeds that up. It makes leaves drop off, which means the combine, when they go through it and cut it and do the combining, it doesn't have as much leaves and stem and stuff to deal with. Well, it has stem, but it doesn't have as much plant material still on that plant to have to separate from the seed, which means so the glyphosate enables farmers to get in faster, earlier, before fall rains and winter rains come and the fields get wet and you get your combine stuck in the back 40 and in the mud. So it lets them get in and out earlier, and it also makes combining faster because there's less plant material to separate from the seed.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Beyond Labels. I'm Dr. Sina McCullough, and I'm here with my amazing co-host, Joel Salatin. How are you today, Joel?
I'm doing great, Sina. Glad to see you.
I'm glad to see you too. We have so much news to share today. First, I want to give an update to our listeners that we posted a story about the first man to ever receive a heart that was a genetically engineered heart from a pig. And sadly, he has passed away roughly 2 months after the transplant. And we don't have any more information as of yet as to the exact cause of his death, but he has sadly passed away. They're still heralding it, though, as a success because he made it past a month. So there's that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, these things are innovation is always rife with failure, and that was a hard podcast. I've heard back from several people, and this end of life and how much do you spend to extend life another 3 months or whatever is really a hard thing. And as you get to my age, you're dealing with elderly parents, and we're dealing with both my mom, who's 98, and our stepmom, who's 81, 82. Both have issues, and I'd like to hope that when I get there, I'll be happy just to go.
Yeah.
And not get just doctored out, parted out, and pieced out. Just anyway.
Yeah.
That was a hard one, and it's not easy to deal with. So yeah, he did pass away, and I think, like you said, generally the scientific community views it as a first time, a first time success, excitement. I'm confident we will see much more of this.
So am I. Yes, and certainly he was a brave man who has now become part of medical history.
Right.
So today I want to talk about, that was a podcast on getting sick later in life. And like, as you said, what do you do about that? Today, I want to talk about another issue that is actually affecting, as we're realizing, younger and younger people across the whole world. And that is the contamination of our food supply with glyphosate. So we have a new report that has come out by the Detox Project, which, is basically founded by a wonderful man, Henry Rollins. And they are basically, that group is very concerned about our exposure level to glyphosate. And so they do independent third-party testing of foods so that we know exactly how much is in our food that we're eating, because obviously the government has dropped the ball on this. willingly, in my opinion. And so they've come out with a detox project seal that we talked about in our book, right? It's a glyphosate residue free verification label that's on food. And this report just emphasizes how much we need these third-party labels. So the report is called The Poison in Our Daily Bread. And I'm going to tell you the punchline, and then I would like to go through it a little bit and get your thoughts as well. The punchline is that now this pre-harvest spraying with glyphosate is actually the leading cause of contamination now of our food supply with glyphosate. So this is known as desiccation of crops, right? This, when you are right before harvest and they're spraying crops with agents like glyphosate, it's a drying agent, and they're spraying it on crops that are conventional crops. They're not even genetically engineered crops, but they spray it to get to market faster. So it basically dries it faster and it dries it more uniformly. And this has become quite a common practice now for the past 2 decades in both the United States and Canada, where these farmers are regularly spraying different crops. And what we're finding is that it is becoming prevalent in the food supply, which was common sense because you're spraying it with this glyphosate right before you harvest it. So less time for the glyphosate to break down or to run off, off the food. So what they did was they tested 83 foods that are found in major grocery stores and national food chains like Walmart, Whole Foods, Target, some national grocers, some items that were bought online through Amazon. And they found that more than half of those foods tested positive for glyphosate. And some of these foods are they're going to probably alarm people because these are things like sprouted whole grain bread, 100% whole wheat bread, chickpeas. And we can go over the list in more detail, but the point is these foods came up, more than half of them, as testing positive. There's out of just the conventional food groups, about 62% of them tested positive, 23 foods out of 37. Then there was a group of foods that were verified by the Non-Gmo project, right, to not contain GMOs. And 18 out of 26 tested positive. So roughly 69% tested positive. Then there's a group of foods that were USDA organic certified foods, and 5 out of 23 tested positive. So roughly 22% of the USDA labeled organic foods tested positive. And so right there, I want to pause right there in this report, because what that is showing us, in my opinion, is that we're no longer seeing a difference in glyphosate exposure between conventional food and non-GMO verified foods. Now, for me, I never expected there to be a difference between those two foods, but one method people used to use in going into the grocery stores when they were trying to avoid a toxic burden on their body from pesticides like glyphosate is they would choose the non-GMO project verified food. And the thought was most of the Roundup was being sprayed on Roundup ready genetically engineered crops, right? So if you avoided then the genetically engineered crops, you would be avoiding most of the glyphosate spray. So I can understand the logic there. But what's happening is that no longer is holding true, all right? Because now we're seeing this massive contamination from the desiccation, and even crops that are not genetically modified are being sprayed under this guise of being a desiccant.
Let me stop you right there, if I may. I'm feeling the confusion or just naivety of people kind of coming back through the whatever screen to us, and so as a farmer, let me just explain when we talk about a desiccant, when we talk about well, why would you spray wheat or barley, right before harvest? It's all about speed. And so years ago, when grains were harvested at maturity, so the plant growth, these are annuals. These are annuals. They have a very fast growth cycle. You plant them in the spring, they grow real fast in the summer. As the summer goes, they start to they make the plump seed, whatever it is, wheat, barley, oats, and then and the leaves fall off. The plant actually goes into maturity, and naturally just kind of the leaves fall off, and nothing's left there, kind of but the stem, some real frail hangers on leaves, and the nice big plump grain, right? And so that was the normal cycle. Well, what's happened is, and then of course that would be harvested and they'd go in. And the way you harvest that, of course, is you have to cut the head off the plant. You have to separate the grain from the husk, the leaves, the stem, the rest of the plant. That's in old historical terms, that was called winnowing. You had to beat it, and then winnow it where the wind would blow away the chaff. What we're talking about here is the chaff, getting the chaff separated from the seed, all the little plant leafy particles. So what farmers have found is that by spraying glyphosate, you can speed up that dry down. So the seed is mature, but the plant still has some greenness and some viability to it as it goes into its last gasps of life of the season. And so the glyphosate speeds that up. It makes leaves drop off, which means the combine, when they go through it and cut it and do the combining, it doesn't have as much leaves and stem and stuff to deal with. Well, it has stem, but it doesn't have as much plant material still on that plant to have to separate from the seed, which means so the glyphosate enables farmers to get in faster, earlier, before fall rains and winter rains come and the fields get wet and you get your combine stuck in the back 40 and in the mud. So it lets them get in and out earlier, and it also makes combining faster because there's less plant material to separate from the seed. So I just wanted to go over that a little bit so people could understand the rationale why a non-GMO, why any conventional farmer would use glyphosate not as weed control, but as plant dry down catalyst to facilitate the harvest, the harvest of the grain.
Yes, that's a great explanation. Thank you. Yeah, and now we actually know that Roundup is, or some kind of glyphosate is sprayed reportedly on more than 70 crops, including almonds, apples, these dry edible beans, lentils, chickpeas, peas, like green peas, grapes, rice, and sunflowers. So it's also sprayed on those. And as you mentioned, it's sprayed to desiccate these other crops like wheat, oats, barley, and dry bean crops pre-harvest. And so just like what you're saying, they're now spraying it at such levels that the level that we're consuming is just increasing at what I think is an unsustainable rate for the human body. So for instance, there's a study, this is listed in the report, which we will attach to this, this podcast. There's a study that was published in 2017 in the Journal of American Medical Association. And what they did was the researchers tracked people for 20 years. These are people in Southern California. They tracked them from 1993, which was just before Roundup Ready crops were released onto the market. and they tracked them through 2016. Over that 20-year period, on average, there was a 500% increase in the amount of glyphosate in the urine of these subjects. Some subjects had levels of glyphosate that surged by 1,208%. And this tracked with this increase in the glyphosate levels in the urine, tracked with the Roundup Ready GMO crops being on the market. So for instance, in 1995, that was the year before the Roundup Ready crops were on the market, farmers were using about 40 million pounds of glyphosate per year. Then it steadily increased with these Roundup Ready crops. And by 2014, farmers were using about 280 million pounds of glyphosate per year. And if you can see on this graph, like I encourage everybody to click on the link and pull it up, because here, I'll hold it up here. If you can see on this graph, Joel, you see it just increased. This is when Roundup Ready crops were introduced. It just shoots right up, right? And today, there's about 300 million pounds of glyphosate that's sprayed, 1 billion pounds of pesticides sprayed per year. It's about a pound for every American citizen, actually. So the point I'm trying to make is our bodies have been carrying this toxic burden of glyphosate for decades now. Originally, according to this report, the cause of this toxic burden on our body was the introduction of Roundup Ready GMO crops. Now what they're finding is that today's contamination, today's increased burden of glyphosate on our body is from this pre-harvest spraying, which means that the old strategy of I'm going to try to avoid glyphosate by avoiding genetically modified crops, that strategy no longer works. And as I said in the beginning, because even these non-GMO verified foods are testing positive, 69% of them roughly tested positive for glyphosate. And you know, Joel, this is something that you and I pointed out in our book, In Beyond Labels. Remember, we went back and forth with, we started with the organic label, and then I was like, no, there's holes in it. We're going to patch up the holes in that organic label bucket. So then the next tip was look for the duo, which was organic label plus the non-GMO label. And then remember, I was like, no, that's not even enough. You have to look for the trio. You have to add the glyphosate residue-free label on top of it. And this is the point in the book when we were like, about ready to throw our hands up and be like, this is how complicated our food supply really is, right? And there was pushback too of people being like, well, why do you have to add all those labels together? Like, isn't that redundant? The USDA organic label should cover glyphosate. It should cover all of these toxins that our body is, likely to be exposed to in the food supply. And as we can see, even from this independent report, it's not enough. The USDA organic label, 22% of those foods tested positive. The non-GMO project label, about 69% of those foods tested positive. So this is verification of what we outlined in our book of how complex the system is. And if you're going to shop in the grocery store, what loops you have to go through just to try to protect yourself from these toxic burdens that are in our food supply.
Right. Just so you know, the feed mill, that does our feeds here at our farm, they actually test every load that comes in for glyphosate. Now we're not in the glyphosate, the third party certification, but there are definitely people and mills and things that are testing, for their own good. My question to you is, how does this? I mean, it's glyphosate is absolutely forbidden in Germany. Verboten on organics. So how does 22% of organics have, I mean, it is absolutely forbidden. Now, I know that like 80%, it's over 70%, maybe not 80, but it's close to that, percent of all organic grains in the U.S. are imported to the U.S. They're not domestically grown, and most of them are coming from the STAN countries, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and they come through Istanbul, Turkey, which of course we can all trust completely, I'm sure, all of those merchant outfits that are coming through Istanbul, Turkey. So so is that where this is, or I mean, is it slippage or is it fraud?
So you and I reported on this before. There is some fraud, and we detailed this in our book. And so there is fraud coming in from other countries. There was at one point like more organic grain imported from, I think it might have been Turkey, one of those countries. We imported more organic grain from them than they can even grow. So yeah, what's happening, right, we're getting conventionally grown grains, and by the time they arrive on our shores, they have magically converted into organic grains. So some of this is fraud. According to the Detox project, and I've seen this reported elsewhere, some of this is also from contamination in the supply chain. And some of this would also be contamination from drift from nearby fields that are spraying Roundup. And so it does tend to drift. Winds can easily drift it, and runoff. I saw a study one time that said that most of the glyphosate that's sprayed on these crops actually doesn't even stay on the plant. It goes down into the soil and it gets into the runoff, with rains. And when they water the crops, glyphosate is water soluble. So it is easily carried in water. So it gets into the runoff and that gets into the water supply. So we've also seen it in drinking water, for instance. And let's go there for a minute, because just so that people understand, if they don't already, I really want to drive home why I feel it's so important to protect yourself from glyphosate, and why I go to great lengths to decrease this toxic burden on my body. All right. I mentioned, for instance, that study where they tracked people for 20 years and the level of glyphosate increased in their urine at alarming levels. According to the study author, by 2000, 30% of the subjects found glyphosate in the urine. As of 2016, 70% of the study cohorts had detectable levels. The levels of glyphosate that were documented in these people in the study were 100-fold greater than those in the famous rat study. Now, let me tell you, the rat study, there's several of them, but here's one of them. In 2017, researchers found that rats exposed to Roundup at only 0.1 parts per billion. That's an extremely low dose, right? This is a concentration, so you can compare it directly to humans. 0.1 parts per billion. Those rats developed non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, okay? Over a 2-year period, the rats developed non-alcoholic fatty liver disease at an extremely low dose, a lower dose than what we're seeing, for instance, in that 20-year tracking study of humans. Now, why do I bring this up? Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is an umbrella term to describe liver disease that's caused by accumulation of too much fat in the liver. Our newest research is indicating that 25% of adults worldwide actually have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. There was a 5-fold increase between 1997 and 2014. So this is a disease that affects 1/4 of the adult population across the world, reportedly. And it has also just skyrocketed in numbers with the use of glyphosate. Now, again, I don't have data to say this is cause and effect. What I'm saying is this is an observation that I am making. And one thing that's very alarming is that the 5-fold increase in this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease has hit young people very hard. So it's hit young people more than older people, and it can decrease your life expectancy by at least 4 years. So this is something that we already know happens in rats, and that now we're seeing this trend in humans. We also know that glyphosate can change your gene expression. There's another rat study also at 0.1 parts per billion, a very low dose of glyphosate. It's been shown to change the function of 4,000 genes in the liver and the kidneys of rats. It's been also connected to birth defects, infertility, other kinds of reproductive issues, miscarriages, increased infant mortality, certain cancers. And also, glyphosate is a patented antibiotic, right? Patented, meaning they knew it was an antibiotic, right, when they filed for that patent. And so what that means is that every time that you're consuming glyphosate, you are potentially killing beneficial microbes in your gastrointestinal tract, right? And as we know, you are more microbe than you are human. We need those microbes in order to survive. You know, one statistic says that we have roughly 10 bacterial cells for every human cell. And we know those microbes help regulate every system in every part of your body. So when you eat antibiotics like glyphosate, you are increasing your likelihood of developing an illness or a disease. We also know that glyphosate weakens the gut barrier by damaging the tight junctions, which can lead to leaky gut. We also now know that glyphosate, because it is water soluble, it travels freely through the blood, and it can actually cause leaky brain. That means, so just like leaky gut, it can get past the blood-brain barrier and go into the brain. And because glyphosate is a chelator, meaning it grabs onto metals, it brings the metals into the brain. So this may be one reason why we're seeing increases in, brain fog, ADHD, autism, Alzheimer's. It could be one reason. Glyphosate also has been linked to like Parkinson's disease, for instance, anxiety, diabetes, obesity, sleep disorders, because it blocks the shikimate pathway, which that was one thing that Monsanto said was, well, humans don't have the shikimate pathway, so this won't affect them. But the microbes in our gastrointestinal tract, some of those microbes have the shikimate pathway. And so we rely on them to make these aromatic amino acids, which are obviously essential to making things like serotonin that we need, and tryptophan, dopamine, things like that are all associated with some of these diseases and conditions I was talking about. You look like you're ready to jump in. So
listen, Sina, you've scared me to death. And I feel our listeners now are just in panic mode. We're almost out of time. So and Sina, honestly, I think, our listeners don't have to be convinced about the evils of glyphosate. Most of us, don't, we're well aware that I don't want to take a swig of glyphosate. And so, now that we're all scared to death, let's give everybody some, I would say, what are the main things to avoid? I think in general, glyphosate, when we talk about the food groups that glyphosate is used on, is primarily small things that get picked. So especially grain-based things like crackers and taco chips and anything that is made with grain or uses processed grain. If we're trying to say, you can help yourself, if you can help yourself dramatically by not consuming any of these, and you talk about old people, when you start talking about, crackers and chips and things like that, as people age and they lose their spouse, a lot of times what you eat becomes, more whatever, snacky, convenience oriented. And so here, right when a person gets elderly, then they start ingesting more of these snacky, convenience, quickie, things that are all grain based, made with grain. Now you mentioned almonds and grapes. I'm sure they've been found there, but in general, glyphosate is used on small things that are picked mechanically, and that's the reason in the grains primarily. So I'm trying to encourage people. You can avoid a lot of this just by watching what you're buying. You can also certainly come to a farm that is that's clean, and you can ask about these things, ask about grain sources. What's your sense on that, and we'll wrap up.
Sure. Yeah. So I always love the solutions, right? The positive aspect. So one of my solutions is you can grow your own, right? Even if you just start small, you can just grow one thing. You can, like you said, another solution is to frequent your local farmers that you trust, right? That aren't using these toxins. And another one is, if you are going to go into the grocery store, like you said, if you're going to buy chips and crackers and whatnot, then you really want to pair those three labels together. You want to pair the USDA organic label with the non-GMO project label, with the glyphosate residue-free detox project label, right? Because even, we said that organic foods, USDA organic foods, did show contamination with glyphosate, a percentage of them, but it was lower. The level was lower. So a lower percentage overall was contaminated, and the level of contamination was lower. All right. So the first thing is you're going to reach for the USDA organic label in the grocery store we're talking about. The next thing is you want to try to pair that with the non-GMO project label, because that one patches up that GMO hole that we talked about in a different episode. Then you want to pair it with the glyphosate residue-free label, because that is the best testing we have at this point for detectable levels of glyphosate in our food. And it is, just like the non-GMO project, it's a third-party independent organization. So whenever I buy something in the grocery store, I pair those three. Now, the glyphosate residue-free label is not as abundant in the grocery store as the non-GMO project, because we haven't demanded it. So what I do is, when I go and there's a product that I want, like you can go to the website, the Detox Project website, and we'll include that website in the show description. You can see the list of foods, list of products that they have verified to be glyphosate residue free. And then you can go into your grocery store and ask them, or call the grocery store and say, can you carry these products? So the more that we demand they carry these products that have been tested, the more that we're likely to get them in the grocery store, and then it supports the label, and we can shift the market that way. To your point, if you go onto the report, which we'll also include in the show description, you can see the top foods that tested positive for glyphosate. These are the ones that are having the desiccant sprayed on them. These are things like whole wheat bread, chickpeas, oats, rice, peas, and black beans, split peas. So it's any of these dried beans, along with wheat, the lentils, and you can just see it's one after the next in those categories that shows up as high levels of glyphosate. So
my point is, it's not squash, apples, watermelons, things like that. I just want people to understand that there are food groups that concentrate this, food groups that it's really not used on very much. And finally, I can't help, Sina, but say, so as a detoxifier, chlorophyll is one of the number one detoxifiers. And so if you're buying meat, poultry, dairy, one of the best ways to get detoxed is for those animals to be pasture based, where they're moved around on pasture, so those animals get a lot of chlorophyll every day, and that chlorophyll is nature's number one detoxicant. So I couldn't help but throw that in as That's yet another safety measure when you're shopping, when you're looking for your farmer. Find one that truly that doesn't have animals out on concrete, out on dirt, but actually has them moved around in this mosaic of pasture where they get a fresh salad bar routinely. Is there any other Sina special regimen for detoxifying yourself that you can share before we close?
Oh, that's a great one. We could do a whole episode on that one.
Well, we could. Yeah, we certainly could. But I think the fear that we've generated with this podcast, I think we can't leave people, with, I'm sitting here. Well, what if I've got 1,000, I'm at this 1,000 parts per million level in my urine. Can I just give us one or two quick little things that we can do to try to drop that a little bit.
Sure. Okay. So while it's not great that glyphosate is water soluble, right? Because as I mentioned, it can get across the blood-brain barrier and whatnot. It's also a benefit because in my opinion, it could be easier to get rid of it in the body. So you want to make sure that you're well hydrated, right? With clean filtered water. Because as I said, glyphosate has contaminated some areas of the water supply. So you want to make sure you're drinking filtered water and it filters out the glyphosate. So plenty of water. You want to make sure you're moving your body. So you're getting your lymph system activated to help detox your body. You're sweating, right? That's another way to detox the body. If you're not able to exercise to sweat, you can even during the warm days, you can go sit outside and sweat that way naturally just through the sun. You can do, infrared treatments, go into saunas. You can sweat that way. Fasting is one way, like a water fast. But of course, you don't want to do that if you're diabetic, of course. But that is another way to try to get rid of glyphosate. Dr. Zach Bush has a product out. It used to be called Restore. Now it's called something like iOS or something, but if you type in Restore, it will come up. And his product has been tested to actually show in the laboratory that it can repair the tight junctions of the body and repair these connections between the microbes in your body, the communication network that glyphosate destroys. So that's another option for what people can do. And I think that if you're consuming conventional foods now, just start switching it over, right? This is one of the best ways you can get the glyphosate out of your body, but if you keep bringing it into your body, you're just fighting a losing battle. So just start switching over. It doesn't have to be, as you said, labeled USDA organic. Go to your local farmer who's using regenerative or organic practices that's not certified, and just start switching over the foods that you're eating so you're not taking in as much of the toxin too.
Wonderful, Sina. Well, thank you. Those are very helpful and actually quite doable. Wouldn't it be interesting to have one of the problems with scientific studies is that they kind of break down with too many variables. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it have been interesting in this 20-year study with these people that were tracked for 20 years to look at the different just one thing, to look at the different hydration among those. Because as you know, what is it, like 80% of Americans are dehydrated. Mm-hmm. Municipal water tastes terrible, so nobody wants to drink it. I drink seemingly gallons a day. I just drink a lot, but we have wonderful water here, on the farm, and so anyway, that whole dehydration issue is a big one. So thank you for bringing this to our attention. Thank you all for listening to this. This is one of those, hot issue things, but it's very personal, as you can tell, and our decisions can make a big difference on where we go with this. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.